They never actually plan to wake up with thoughts of you occupying their mind. That's the first thing you need to understand. Most individuals are far too fragile to face what they've been suppressing through pure willpower. Intensity had already taken hold of them because indifference works quietly, almost invisibly. But this wasn't quiet. This was a conflict they've been losing behind closed eyes. You sensed it, didn't you? That slight shift, that unseen pull, like something unspoken growing just beneath their surface. Not distance, not uncertainty, but something far more dangerous, recognition. But here's the truth. People don't welcome their emotions when they surface. They resist them. They question them. They push them down beneath logic, pride, and carefully constructed barriers because what they feel for you doesn't align with the identity they're trying so hard to maintain. And this is where it turns risky. The deeper a feeling threatens the ego, the more forcefully it gets pushed down. Freud referred to this as repression, the mind's method of burying unacceptable desires in darkness. But repression isn't erasure, it's pressure, and pressure always finds an outlet. Most people never become aware of this. What they couldn't admit yesterday becomes what controls them today. That's why this morning felt different. Not because something started, but because something finally broke, and you weren't there to witness it. That's what makes it so unsettling. This wasn't a confession. This wasn't a message. This was a silent collapse of denial, a moment where distraction failed, where their usual escape routes disappeared, where silence became too heavy to ignore. And in that silence you appeared not as a memory but as a reckoning. You see, attraction is easy to dismiss. Curiosity is easy to ignore. But emotional significance, that's where the mind begins to fracture because it forces a question they've been avoiding. Why does this person affect them so deeply? And they try to answer it with logic. They told themselves it was temporary. They convinced themselves it meant nothing serious. They labeled it coincidence, chemistry, circumstance, anything except the truth. But here's the truth. You don't rationalize something that carries no weight. You don't battle something that isn't real. You don't bury something that lacks power. And this is where their mask began to crack. Because every attempt to erase you made you more vivid. Every effort to step away pulled them deeper in. Every distraction failed at the exact moment they needed it most. That's not weakness. That's inevitability. But they didn't want inevitability. They wanted control, and you disrupted that. You became the variable they couldn't solve, the feeling they couldn't predict, the presence they couldn't neutralize. And that's what frightened them. Not you, but what you awakened inside them. Because you didn't just stir something, you awakened something they couldn't control. And people don't fear emotions. They fear losing control over themselves. That's why they pulled back. That's why they became inconsistent. That's why their energy felt scattered. Not because they felt too little, but because they felt far too much. And too much demands a decision, and they weren't ready for that. But here's the truth most people never admit. Avoidance is not the absence of desire. It's evidence of it. And this is where their inner conflict began consuming them. The conscious mind commands stay distant, stay logical, stay protected. But the subconscious, the part that never negotiates, kept bringing you back. Not physically, but in a way far more intense. It rebuilt your presence in their thoughts, in their quiet moments, in every space where distraction disappeared. And they began noticing something unsettling. You weren't fading. You were becoming clearer, more defined, more undeniable. And that's when denial starts to lose its ground, because denial requires distance. But your impact was growing, not physically, but psychologically. And this is where it deepens even further. Once a feeling moves from conscious doubt into subconscious certainty, it no longer asks for permission. It demands recognition. And that moment, that exact moment, arrived this morning. Not with chaos, not with noise, but in a way that shook them more than any spoken confession ever could. Because it wasn't said, it was realized. And realization cannot be undone. You can mislead others. You can even mislead yourself for a time. But once the mind truly knows, it doesn't release it. And they know now, not partially, not vaguely, but completely. But here's what makes it even more destabilizing. Acceptance doesn't bring peace right away. It brings chaos because now they have to face everything they were avoiding. What this means, what it changes, what it requires, and most of all, what they risk losing by ignoring it. Because feelings like this don't stay neutral. They grow, they intensify, they move forward. And right now, they're standing at the edge of that pressure, trying to hold on to control while everything beneath them shifts. And here's the part they still won't admit. This was never just about you. It was about what you awakened within them, and that awakening is far from over. They believed acceptance would quiet everything. They were completely mistaken because what they admitted this morning didn't calm the storm. It gave it a name, and once something has a name, escape becomes much harder. Awareness doesn't reduce intensity. It sharpens it. It transforms vague emotion into undeniable reality. And that reality began pressing against them almost immediately. Now they can't pretend anymore. Now every thought carries weight. Every memory feels intentional. Every silence feels charged. And this is where it becomes dangerous. Because when the mind can no longer deny something, it begins to split. One part moves toward you, another tries to pull away, and neither side surrenders. This isn't confusion, it's internal division. A struggle between opposing forces, the desire and the defense, the pull and the resistance. And right now, both are growing stronger because what they feel for you isn't simple attraction anymore. It's something deeper, something closer to attachment trying to take form. And attachment is threatening to someone who fears losing control. Most people never recognize this, but the deeper the emotional current, the stronger the psychological defenses become. That's why, after recognizing their feelings, they didn't move forward. They paused. They analyzed. They overthought things that once felt natural because now it carries weight. And anything with weight feels like a risk, a threat to their independence, a threat to their identity, a threat to the self-image they've spent years constructing. But here's the truth. You don't fear what you don't value. This is where their inner conflict becomes impossible for them to overlook. The very feeling drawing them closer is also the same force pushing them away, and that contradiction begins to exhaust them. It follows them into every part of their day. It seeps into moments that once felt simple and neutral because now everything seems to carry your echo, not in an obvious way, but symbolically. A certain tone, a pause in conversation, a specific kind of silence. And suddenly, they find themselves pulled back into thoughts of you in ways they never consciously chose, feeling emotions they never intended to allow. And this is where the subconscious begins to tighten its hold, because it has no concern for timing. It completely ignores logic and reason. It only reacts to what carries emotional weight. And you have crossed that invisible threshold, which means you are no longer optional within their mind. But this is where it becomes almost unbearable for them, because now they are forced to confront the question they've been trying to avoid at all costs. Why you? Out of every possibility, every person, why does your presence affect them in this specific way? And the more they search for a logical answer, the less sense it seems to make. Because this was not built on convenience. It didn't form through simple circumstances. It cannot be reduced into something easily explained. It's something deeper, something rooted in a kind of recognition. And recognition is unsettling because it feels inevitable, like something they didn't choose yet cannot escape. And this is the exact moment where their fear begins to intensify. Because if this feeling is real, then it requires something from them. It demands action, vulnerability, exposure, and they have spent years avoiding all three. So what do they do in response? They hesitate. They create space. They attempt to slow something that is already accelerating within them. But what most people fail to understand is this: distance does not weaken a genuine connection. It actually strengthens it, because absence removes distractions. And when distractions disappear, only the truth remains, and that truth is not fading. It's getting louder, not quieter, stronger, not weaker. And they can feel it, in the way their thoughts constantly return to you, in the way emotions rise unexpectedly, in the way something inside them refuses to settle no matter how hard they try to contain it, in the way suppression continues to fail again and again and again. And this is where real tension starts to take hold, because now they are aware, yet still resisting. They sense it, yet continue to question it. They recognize it, yet still avoid facing its full weight. And this creates a kind of psychological pressure that never fully releases. It accumulates, it builds, it tightens until something eventually has to give. But what makes it even more suffocating is this: They are not only fighting the feeling itself, they are also confronting what that feeling reveals about them. Because what they feel for you exposes what they have hidden even from themselves. The desire to connect, the longing to be deeply seen, the fear of being affected. And that last one is the most dangerous because being affected means becoming vulnerable. And vulnerability means letting go of control. And they are nowhere near comfortable with that reality. So they begin to fluctuate. One moment they lean in emotionally, the next they pull back mentally. One moment they imagine what this could turn into, the next they convince themselves it is too much, too complicated, too risky. And this push and pull dynamic is not random. It is a defense mechanism, a way to allow themselves to feel without fully surrendering to it. But here is the truth. You cannot partially experience something this deep. You can only postpone it, and postponement always comes with a cost, because suppressed emotion does not disappear. It transforms into tension, into restlessness, into a constant internal noise they cannot quiet. And recently that noise has been growing stronger, sharper, more persistent. And this is where it becomes impossible for them to ignore, because now it is affecting them not just emotionally, but mentally, behaviorally, even physically. It shows up in their focus, in their mood, in how they respond to situations that have nothing to do with you. Because somewhere underneath everything, an unresolved truth is rising, and it is demanding something they are not ready to give. Not yet, but soon. Very soon they will not have a choice because pressure like this does not remain stable. It intensifies, and right now they are much closer to that breaking point than they realize. Something is beginning to fracture. Not on the surface because they are maintaining that with practiced composure, but underneath where the mind stops performing, where the masks lose shape, where truth exists without permission, that is where it is happening. And they can feel it, not clearly, not comfortably, but undeniably, because repression always comes with a price. And that price is now coming due. But here is the reality. The longer someone suppresses something real, the more forcefully it returns. Not gently, not logically, but with an intensity that cuts through everything. And this is where their sense of control begins to slip, because what once felt manageable now feels intrusive. What once felt distant now feels immediate, and what once felt deniable now feels completely undeniable. And this is where it becomes dangerous. Because when the subconscious can no longer be contained, it does not negotiate. It erupts. Freud warned that what we repress never truly disappears. It finds other ways to return, but this is no longer hidden. This is direct, raw, and unfiltered, and it is breaking through in ways they never anticipated. In their reactions, in their irritability, in how small things trigger disproportionate frustration, in the way their focus dissolves the moment you enter their thoughts. Because now it is no longer just a passing thought. It is an interruption, a psychological jolt they can no longer control, and they are beginning to realize something deeply unsettling. You are no longer just someone in their life. You are someone embedded within their inner world, and that distinction changes everything, because external things can be avoided, dismissed, replaced. But internal realities follow you into silence, into sleep, into every moment you believed belonged only to you. And this is where their resistance starts to crack. Because now the question is no longer, do I feel something? That question has already been answered. Now the question is, what am I going to do with this? And that is the question they fear the most. Because action means exposure. Exposure leads to vulnerability. And vulnerability means releasing control. But here is the truth. Most people spend their entire lives avoiding this. You cannot control something that has already changed you. And you have changed them. Not on the surface, not temporarily, but at a deeper level in how they process emotions, in how they understand connection, in how they now experience your absence. Because your absence has become louder than your presence ever was. And that is what is breaking them. Not just missing you, but feeling you regardless. And this creates a tension that refuses to resolve. It loops endlessly. It returns repeatedly. It intensifies with time, growing stronger each moment they try to ignore it. Because every attempt they make to move beyond you keeps guiding them right back to the same realization. Nothing else feels quite the same. And that quiet, almost unspoken comparison is slowly tearing down their defenses because now everything else feels less intense, less meaningful, less real. And that forces a truth they tried so hard to avoid. This cannot be replaced. And this is where a quiet kind of panic begins to rise. Not loud, not obvious, but slow and creeping beneath the surface. Because if something cannot be replaced, then losing it becomes real. And the fear of losing something genuine is far more powerful than the fear of never having it in the first place. And this is where their behavior begins to shift in ways even they don't fully understand. They become inconsistent, unpredictable, pulled between impulse and restraint. Because one part of them wants to move toward you, to end the tension, to face the truth, to quiet the internal noise. But another part, a louder and more conditioned part, insists they hold back, protect themselves, avoid what feels too overwhelming to face. And this internal conflict is draining them because neither side is winning and neither side is letting go. And this is where the pressure becomes unbearable. Because now it's no longer just emotional, it feels existential. It forces them to confront who they truly are versus who they have been pretending to be. Because the version of them that avoids you is not the same version that feels you, and they cannot sustain both forever. One of them has to give. And this is where things become even sharper. Because they are beginning to recognize their own patterns. They catch themselves avoiding, deflecting, distracting whenever something gets too close to the truth. And that awareness is deeply uncomfortable. It strips away the illusion of control because now they see it clearly. The defenses, the justifications, the ways they've been running. And once you see your own avoidance, you cannot unsee it. And that creates a pressure that makes retreat feel impossible. Because now even avoidance feels empty. Even distance feels artificial. Even silence begins to feel like a betrayal. And this is where the breaking point starts to solidify because they are running out of places to hide within themselves. They cannot return to ignorance. They cannot go back to numbness. They cannot return to who they were before this moment because something fundamental has shifted inside them. And that shift is demanding resolution. Not someday, not eventually, but soon. Because the mind cannot sustain this level of contradiction forever. Eventually it demands a decision. And they are standing right at that edge, closer than they want to admit. Because one more wave of pressure, one more moment of clarity, one more collapse of resistance, and they won't be able to hold it back any longer. This is where it ends. Not gradually, not gently, but with a breaking point. They can no longer delay, because the mind can survive confusion. It can endure denial, but it cannot withstand constant contradiction without eventually breaking. And they are breaking not visibly, not in ways others would notice, but internally where truth has finally cornered them. Because now there is no escape left. Not in logic, not in distraction, not in distance. Every path they relied on has failed. And here is the truth. The final stage of repression is not silence, it is confrontation. And confrontation is coming whether they are ready or not. Because the subconscious no longer asks for permission, it demands alignment. And right now, they are not aligned with themselves, because what they feel and what they do are in direct conflict. And that conflict is creating something unbearable. Psychological dissonance, a tension so sharp it forces a decision. And this is where it becomes irreversible. Because once the mind reaches this point, it does not retreat. It does not settle. It does not quiet down. It decides. And that decision is forming right now. Not in words, not in some dramatic declaration, but in a silent, unavoidable realization they can no longer escape. This matters not slightly, not temporarily, but deeply and permanently. And once something is defined in that way, it begins to reshape their entire way of thinking. Because now every excuse feels empty. Every delay feels constructed. Every attempt to dismiss it feels like a quiet form of self-betrayal. And that is the moment everything begins to give way. Because people can endure pain, they can tolerate fear, but they cannot continue betraying their own deepest truth forever. Eventually a choice has to be made, and they are approaching that threshold now where the cost of avoiding you is becoming heavier than the cost of facing you. And that shift, this precise internal shift, is what changes everything. Because now you are no longer the obstacle. Avoidance is. And once the mind identifies the true barrier, it stops protecting it. It begins dismantling it piece by piece, excuse by excuse, wall by wall. And they feel that process unfolding. They feel their resistance weakening, not because they wanted to, but because they can no longer justify holding on to it. And this is where the illusion finally collapses. The illusion that they can maintain control. The illusion that they can carry this feeling and never act on it. The illusion that time will somehow make it disappear. But time didn't make it disappear. Time revealed it, strengthened it, clarified it. And now it has nowhere left to go but outward. Because internal truths that reach this level demand expression. That is the final stage. And they are there, right at that boundary where silence becomes unbearable, where inaction feels heavier than risk, where the question is no longer should I do something, but how much longer can I avoid doing something? And the answer is not much longer, because something within them has already decided, even if they haven't acted yet. Even if they are still trying to hold on to fragments of control, the decision has already been made beneath conscious thought. And that is what matters, because action follows conviction, and their conviction has completely shifted. They no longer question you. They no longer doubt what they feel. They no longer minimize it. They know. And knowing is the point of no return, because now every moment of silence feels wrong. Every second of distance feels unnatural. Every attempt at pretense falls apart before it can even take shape. And this is where everything converges. The pressure, the awareness, the emotion, the fear, all collapsing into one unavoidable realization. They cannot continue like this. Something has to change. And when that realization locks into place, action stops being optional and becomes inevitable. Not necessarily immediate, but unavoidable. Because once the internal world shifts this deeply, the external world must eventually follow.